Professor O'Mara, thank you for participating in our first habits conversation dedicated to movement, with the attention of how our body works, why movement is important, and most importantly, how to form healthy habits. Professor O'Mara is a neuroscientist, and his academic activity is focused on cerebral systems that enable learning, memory, and knowledge, and the understanding of how stress and depression affects them. He studied very interesting topics like interrogation and the neuroscience of interrogation, the business of the brain for life, and the business of the brain for business. But mostly, and that is the main purpose of our encounter today, because you are a great walker. And we at the Society of Healthy People, the movement we have founded with my colleague a year ago, we are also people that walk. I'm going to make a little preamble before asking you the first question. We all think that we know what walking is and why is it good for our body and for our soul. After all, walking is so wired in the human being, it is almost boring and unnoticeable. The same with healthy habits. We all seem to know what is good for you, what is good for our body, for our mind, and for our spirit. However, adopting healthy habits seems to be so difficult for many of us. So we know walking is good for muscles, is good for posture, is good for repairing organs. It contributes to stop the decline of age, is a tool for creativity, and also a social glue. But what are the top 3 things people do not know about walking and the value of walking, and how yourself came to walking of all activities?
Okay, so I think you've summarized everything that I think very well in your preamble. I think if I was to focus on the things that people don't know about walking, I think the first thing to say is that walking evolved as a social activity. We're used to thinking of walking as something that an individual does for the purposes of their health. But actually, if you go back in time and look at how humans evolved, how we moved out of Africa, 60 to 100,000 years ago, we did it in tribes, we did it in groups, and we did it together. So this means that walking actually enters into our social consciousness in ways that we just don't appreciate. So to give you a very simple example, if you put somebody in a brain scanner and you play them random noises, you will get activity in the parts of the brain that are concerned with hearing. If you instead play them noises of footfall, somebody walking along a corridor, tip, clop, tip, clop, tip, clop, you'll get activity in the parts of the brain that are concerned with hearing, but you also get activity in the parts of the brain concerned with social thinking. This is a really quite remarkable phenomenon. And if you think about it, we actually are able to tell who's coming down the corridor very often because we can tell the difference between different people's footfalls. If we push the thought a little bit further about the kinds of things that people don't know about walking, when people walk in groups, when they walk together, this is a unique human behavior. We walk in protest to change things that we don't like about our political world, our legal world. Animals do not do this. Chimpanzees do not band together to say that they want to change the constitution or to protest against the actions of a president. And something very remarkable happens to humans in these circumstances, which is that we feel that the boundary between ourselves and others dissolves a little. We identify not just with ourselves as individuals, but we also identify with the larger purpose of the group. And this happens when we're walking together in a crowd for what is in effect an imagined purpose, but one that nonetheless dominates our lives. So that's 2 things. So then let me just point to a third thing. We're in this kind of terrible pandemic situation at the moment, and getting exercise is very, very difficult. But walking, especially if you can walk with family members who are within your own pandemic group, is a very good way of enhancing your social bonds, ensuring that your body and brain get the outdoor exposure that you need, and it will foster aspects of conversation and togetherness that otherwise would not occur if you were just sitting down watching the television. So it's a kind of a collaborative transactional thing that you can do together that actually turns out to be remarkably enjoyable, even for those people who think they don't like walking.
Thank you. Well, in your book, there was one thing I particularly noticed, and that's how the climatization system of the human being is differentiating us from other species, and it is making us more competitive when we compare with the other animals. I mean, I'm talking about the perspiration system of the human beings.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is something that we don't share with many other animals, actually. And it turns out to be a remarkable adaptation that we have, that we can sweat, we can perspire, and the animals that we typically hunt can't. They cool by breathing. We can cool by perspiration, and we can cool by breathing, which means that actually we're good runners and we're very good long distance walkers. And we can walk at times that animals like tigers and lions can't, because they cast a big shadow. So they sleep and lie around during the noonday sun. So we can hunt at that kind of time and be relatively safe from predation by these big animals.
That's fascinating, I found. Can you explain in very simple terms, so for a layman like me, the relationship between the brain and walking, and the consequences of walking on our overall state of mind?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to think about this. One is to think about it from the inside out, and the other is to think about it from the outside in. So let's think about it from the inside out first. So I'm seated, you're standing, but the same thing will happen in both of us if we decide to walk. We form an intention, which will be formed somewhere usually in the frontal lobes of the brain. That sends a command signal to the motor system, and we have to stand up, we have to stabilize our position, we have to decide where we're going to. So you must have a map in your mind of the layout of your world, and then you have to figure out a route. And this is a problem that's common to humans, it's common to chimpanzees, it's common to rats, common to all species that move around. You need to have these two systems talking to each other. The one that allows you to move and the one that allows you to know where you are. And then you start moving. And the amazing thing about walking is that once you've started moving, if the ground you're walking on is stable, so let's say you're walking on a good surface, the spinal cord takes care of the rhythm of movement. You don't have to think about it at all. That's why you can talk, you can carry things, you can look at the birds or whatever it happens to be. So that's kind of from the outside or the inside out. Now, think about it from the outside in. When you're out and you're moving around, you're being exposed to things that you're not when you're seated at your desk. You're feeling the wind on your face, you're being exposed to light, you're being exposed to continual minor changes in the gradation of the surface that you're walking on. It might be a little bit slippy in some places, it might be very hard in others, all of those kinds of things. So you're challenging yourself through this exposure to the environment. And this is why going outside, preferably for a walk, is a good thing, because there's an element of randomness that's good for you that you don't get from a treadmill. A treadmill is predictable, and I'm not against treadmills by any means, but the challenge from a walk outdoors is quite different to the challenge that you get from a treadmill, which is set to a constant speed and that all of those kinds of things.
A splendid machine the human body is.
Yes, an amazing, amazing machine, and we don't appreciate it enough.
Okay, so you are a walker, and in fact, a great walker, so passionate about it, so passionate that you even wrote this amazing book, which we all read at the Society of Healthy People, in praise of walking. It has been translated in Romania recently, last year, and it's called Elogiul Mersului. So how do you develop walking into a habit? How do you assume at the beginning of your walk, and we're going to talk a little bit about culture as well, but at the beginning, how did you transform your walking into a habit?
So that's a great question, one I've puzzled about a lot. So I think the first place to start is in terms of the metabolic drives that humans have. You can't walk if you don't have energy. So you must have energy from somewhere. We get that from our food, and we get it from oxygen and from water. And humans evolved in a landscape that was energy poor. So when we got energy, we sat around after eating it. You hunted an animal, you gathered the honey, you got the tubers, you got the berries, whatever it happens to be. So not wasting energy is at a premium. But in the modern world, food is everywhere. We've solved the problem of calorie sourcing. It's really, not a great issue. That's not to say that there aren't hungry people and there are people who don't have adequate diets. That is absolutely the case. But in general, there's plenty of food to feed everybody. The politics of that are a separate issue. So what I want to do is focus on the evolution. So your natural tendency is to want to conserve energy. And that makes sense. So you've got this inbuilt thing that says we must conserve energy. There may be times of famine ahead. There may be times of shortage. But that's not the world we're in. The world we're in is one of access to food. So how do you build a habit? So I think there's really two different answers to this. One is a focus on the individual. And I think the best thing you can do is, if we all, I think, have smartphones now, turn the pedometer on your smartphone and have the only notification that I have on my smartphone is the number of steps I walk. And I set a target to do every day. And the truth is, nobody remembers how much they walk. So if I asked you how many steps you took yesterday, unless you've got your smartphone, you don't know. I can tell you I walked 17,000 steps yesterday, but I only know that because I recorded it on my phone. But if you ask me what I did last Friday, I can't tell you. I just don't know. I have to look up the phone. So we don't know how much we walk. So the easiest spur to action is to have your pedometer on, and ideally look at your performance relative to your age group, your gender, all of those kinds of things, and see how you're performing, and try and get into the habit of checking that constantly. So that's kind of a focus on the individual. I think another important aspect of the focus on the individual is having a partner to walk with. Walking is very enjoyable, and the best experiences often you'll have of walking are with other people. So, we have WhatsApp groups, we've got Facebook groups, we've got all sorts of ways of finding partners to walk with now that we didn't have even, 5 or 10 years ago. So try and take advantage of those. And these are low cost, easy ways that individuals and groups can walk together. Now, the other side of walking is the kind of the larger picture away from the individual. And this comes down to how we've designed our society. We up until the pandemic hit, I think we were very car oriented and not individual mobility oriented. What I've seen in a great many places, now this is just online obviously because I haven't been traveling, is suddenly bicycle lanes and walking lanes are being made available for people rather than using public transport, or rather than using private transport in cars. And the more that we can facilitate people to walk under their own steam through the design of the environment, the better off we will be. So I'll give you a small example of that. In the building I work in Trinity College in Dublin, it's a 6 or 7 story building. And when you come in the front door, if you want to get up to my room or my office on the 3rd floor, your choice is very simple. There's a lift in front of you, an elevator in front of you. If you want to take the stairs, you have to go through 3 fire doors. So we've engineered an environment where the default is to be passively transported. And what we really need to do is think about how we design the environment so that people get walking in without thinking about it. So it's the default. And that's something that we need a partnership with architects, engineers, and lots of other people like that who need to think not just about the beauty of the building. They need to think about the well-being of the occupants.
You said something very interesting about the individual approach to walking, and therefore I wanted to ask you, do you think there are different benefits to the mind when you walk on your own versus when you walk with a group of people?
Oh yes, for sure. Now we don't have good data on this. There's some little bits of case study work in the literature, and there's personal experience. So the case study work kind of focuses on this idea that walking for thinking is a really, really important phenomenon, and one that's overlooked. That when we're up and moving around in the world, our senses are sharpened and our ability to think through a problem can often be enhanced. And if you're trying to think through a problem, you're better off probably doing that by yourself rather than doing it with somebody else, because that person will interrupt the train of your thoughts. But it depends on the problem. If you have a problem with another person, go for a walk with them and talk it out is the obvious thing to do. But, for example, when I was writing that book or the book I'm doing at the moment, what I typically do is I write out notes. I take out my digital voice recorder and I walk and talk. And I don't want anybody to be talking to me when I'm doing this because often I'll end up dictating much more than the contents of the notes. And that happens because of the spur from walking. So I think that kind of aspect is very important. And sometimes, when you've got a difficult personal problem to think through, going off by yourself is actually the right thing to do. And other times it may be going with other people. But sometimes when this has often happened to me when I've been out for a walk with a group. The group will string out. The trails that you're on may only be a person wide, and you might end up walking by yourself for a while. And that's lovely too, because you can join the group and you can leave the group as it suits you.
Well, therefore, would you say, for instance, that when you sit in a room, one across the other, and you have a difficult topic to discuss, looking at each other is a sort of a confrontational situation, while you can say things are more difficult or more easier shoulder to shoulder when you walk with somebody next to you? Is it easier?
Yes, and I think this has been an ancient teaching of the philosophers, that the way you solve problems jointly together is you walk together. But the great thing about walking is you are shoulder to shoulder, your eyes are fixed on the horizon, they're not fixed at each other, so you don't have this adversarial stance right from the get-go. Going for a walk is a good way of reducing interpersonal conflict.
Oh, thank you. I think people outside would like to know whether there is a relationship between the circadian rhythm and walking.
Oh, that's something actually I've wondered about, and there's no good data in the literature where this is concerned. So all I could really say is that there are times when walking is easier than others. Sometimes you walk and it is a drudge. You just don't really feel like doing it and you're quite slow. And there are other times you do it and it's hey, everything's going really great. The one thought I do have on the circadian rhythm, though, is that I have an idea that going for a walk in the evening into the night before you go to bed helps the quality of your sleep. I don't know if this is true or not, but the argument is very straightforward. When you walk at night, you're out in conditions of reduced lighting. And one of the things that your circadian rhythm for sleeping is set by is the amount of light that you're exposed to. So I think at least from being outdoors in a condition where the amount of light has been reduced will perhaps help. And the other thing it may help with is it's cooler in the evening. And one of the things that your body does when you're trying to sleep is it reduces your body temperature by about a degree C, or maybe 1.5 degrees C. You don't need to be overheated. So this is a good time, perhaps, to lose a little bit of heat. So it may be that night walking, which is something I love to do, is actually a good thing where sleeping is concerned.
Yeah, well, in fact, there are some old school doctors in Romania that prescribe a good 10 kilometers again a day against the insomnia issue. So we have that too here.
Yes. I in fact, that's advice that I've often heard, and I think as a something to do instead of taking drugs, you're probably much better off. In fact, let me tell you a small story. A friend of mine whose children are now grown up, but he had 4 girls, and he used to find himself waking up at 4 a.m. in the morning quite a bit. And what he would do is he found he couldn't go back to sleep easily. So he would walk from his house, which is about 3 kilometers from where I live, to the top of the hill, which is about 1 kilometer away from where I live, and back again, and then into bed. And he always found that worked very well.
That's a good story. Now, a couple of cultural aspects. From what we know, Ireland is quite good at training people to do a lot of sport. That's at least the perception we have here in Romania. Well, it's not really the case in our country. It's evolving, but it's not really the case so far. So what advice would you give to people about what could motivate them to start walking actively in a culture where walking is not really an activity, is not really binded in our education?
Yeah, so you're right that there's a lot of emphasis on active living and sport in Ireland. That used not be the case. This is something that's happened over the last 20 or so years. So there's really, again, two aspects to this. One is what the individual can do, and it's always easier and better to do it with others. You can form an informal walking group or club very, very easily now using social media. The other side of it, though, is what government, local government, the health authorities and all of these other individuals do where the promotion of sport is concerned, or the educational authorities. You need policies from the top down saying this is what we want in society and this is how it will work. And you need a push from the bottom up from individuals to say this is how we want to do these things. And putting these two things together is not easy. But if you have the two elements, you can get much more done than by anyone by itself.
That's exactly what our movement tries to do, because we're trying to influence in such a way that more public policies in the area of prevention are applied to Romania as well. Now I'm going to ask you something about the weather. The weather climate in Ireland can sometimes be very difficult and with a lot of rain. And in Romania, we used to have a temperate climate. Right now, or also in the winter, it can be very, very cold. People in my country tend to overheat and overdress. From a walker point of view, knowing what you know, what can you tell us about how can people adapt to adverse climate, especially when you would go out walking? Our walkers, for instance, at the beginning ourselves, we were dressing very heavily when we started to walk. Right now, we're not doing this anymore. So what kind of advice can you give us in terms of adaptation to the climate?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, obviously, is check the weather. And see what temperatures are going to be like, see whether or not there's going to be rain or not. And then, wear thin layers, but several of them, so you can take layers off easily and wrap them up, stick them in a bag. My own favorite walking weather is when it's cold and sunny. And that way you can walk very long distances without dehydrating or overheating. And I think, what people underestimate about walking quite a bit is that once you get moving, and let's say you're maybe 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers into your walk, you actually start to generate quite significant amounts of heat. So what you need to do is think that the temperature that you're feeling now is not the temperature you will be experiencing in 20 minutes time. So ideally, wear some light layers. I think if you can wear natural fabrics like cottons, linens, and wool, or breathables, again, you're much better off. There are some very good Gore-Tex materials available now. And I think it's just and then there are things that you need to avoid. Denim is a terrible, jeans are terrible to walk in. Light cotton trousers or whatever are much, much better. But you'll figure it out yourself after a couple of goes. And one thing that always strikes me is when the weather is terrible and you've gone for a walk in it and it's awful, one of the nicest feelings you can have is when you get back home. So having walked in the rain and all of the rest of it, you feel very good afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. We're also starting to discover our city, and we've been living here for many, many years, many of us. And through walking, we're discovering a lot of new elements that are just enriching our mindset and our knowledge about our own lives. So we're also city walkers like yourself. So then what do you do? We're now coming slowly to the end of our discussion. What do you do when you really, really don't feel like it? So how do you know when your body's aching, maybe from the previous exercises, you really had a longer night, it's raining and it's freezing cold, you really don't feel like it. So what do you do?
Well, so I rarely feel like that, which is good. But there are times, of course, when I don't feel like walking. And what usually rescues me is I have a friend I walk with quite a bit. And he takes his dog out for a walk in the evenings and he texts me and he says, will you come for a walk? And my rule is to always say yes. So he's my motivation.
So then you walk every day?
Yes, and I will. What I try and do is 2 or 3 walks per day at least. So take a morning walk of maybe 3,000 steps, an early afternoon walk of another couple of thousand, and then an evening walk of another couple of thousand. And then suddenly you've done 12, 14,000 steps without thinking about it. And if we were doing this call, or if we were doing this conversation by phone call, I would be walking while we were doing it. And in 45 minutes, you can add another 3,500 or 4,000 steps without even thinking about it.
Professor O'Mara, thank you for your time and for your generosity in talking to us today about walking and the benefits of a healthy habit of walking. Thank you so much. And thank you to the viewers of our first conversation about movement on Society of Healthy People. Thank you. Vă mulțumim că ne-ați urmărit, sperăm că v-a fost de folos ceea ce ați auzit și vă invităm în comunitatea noastră, Societatea Omului Sănătos.